Hello, my name is Fabricio Tocco. I'm a lecturer of Spanish and the Portuguese convener at the ANU, and I'm going to be presenting today on Coups and Magnicides as Magnification, the production of pasts and futures in Latin American political thrillers. This presentation is part of my current research on my second book, actually, which is called Precarious Secrets, A History of the Latin American Political Thriller. And I'm going to start with a quote. I'm going to turn my camera off so it goes faster and smoother. How could a country with illiterate Indians and a white minority made of racist landowners who despise and treat them as slaves become a modern democracy? Mario Vargas Llosa's latest novel, Tiempos Recios, starts with this rhetorical question about the past and potential futures of Guatemala. These words, of course, echo the beginning of an earlier work by the Peruvian author, Conversación en la Catedral. As you probably know, in this novel, the student Santiago Zavala famously asks, ¿En qué momento se jodió el Perú? Which roughly translates as, at what precise moment had Peru screwed itself up? Brought to the 1954 Guatemalan context, the question that opens Tiempos Recios could perhaps be paraphrased in similar terms. When did Guatemala become a state drowned in warfare and civil unrest? But the question's starting point differs significantly. For once, Peru was one of the centers of power in Latin America, both in pre-Columbian and colonial times. Zavala's question about Peru, then, presumes either an idealized Incan golden past or, from a European settler perspective, the Spanish colonial period, followed by a history of decay. Instead, in Guatemala, decadence seems all-pervasive. Bernays' simple question implies that not only is the present as ruined as the past, but so is the future, in that democracy for Bernays will always be unattainable in Guatemala. But who is Bernays? Bernays is a character who wonders about the past and the future of Guatemala in Tiempos Recios. He's no other than the American father of spin, the person who was in charge of the propaganda that paved the way for the 1954 Guatemalan coup. As we know, this interruption of a political regime is significant in the region, as it inaugurates a series of many coups that punctuated the history of the Cold War in Latin America over the second half of the 20th century. It is at this historical point, perhaps, where Vargas Llosa considers that Guatemala, and maybe even the whole region, screwed itself up. The 1954 coup brought the ousting of then Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. Bernays thoroughly aimed his propaganda at convincing the American public that the US had to intervene in the Central American Republic, linking Arbenz to the Soviet bloc. Vargas Llosa, however, spends a great deal of his novel reshaping Arbenz, as someone who is far from being the communist stooge that Bernays' right-wing propaganda portrayed. For him, Arbenz tried to alter the status quo, but only within the legal framework of liberal democracy. Arbenz, Vargas Llosa reminds us, fostered an agrarian reform, allowed unions, and taxed, but not expelled, the United Fruit in Guatemala. As several critics note, conspiracies are at the heart of American political thrillers. In Latin American renditions of the genre, conspiracies features in the retelling of historical events, with a special focus on problematizing the history of coups, such as the Guatemalan. In this sense, Vargas Llosa would agree with Italian philosopher Norberto Bobbio that conspiracies are the tyrant's necessary double. Both go hand in hand. Autocratic power not only aspires to disclose alien secrets better than democratic power, but also, when needed, it invents secrets to reinforce itself, to justify its own existence. Vargas Llosa's main declared intent is to show that the true plotters, Bernays and other American agents, justify the coup by fabricating a fictional sedition, in this case, an imminent communist revolution, embodied in an equally imaginary tyrant, Arbenz. This is what led critics such as Cuban journalist Rafael Rojas to claim his surprise regarding Vargas Llosa's affinity with a traditional Latin American Marxist narrative about the 1954 coup. However, I would like to nuance this reading in this paper. Recios turns Arbenz into a benevolent leader, someone who wanted Guatemala to become the truncated modern democracy that Bernays deemed to be impossible in the region. The novel turns the overthrown president into a liberal martyr, ascribing by extension an aura of martyrdom to classic liberalism itself, lost in the midst of the Cold War. Between the United States' imperialist foreign policy and the Soviet Union influence in Latin America, Vargas Llosa seems to say, the true defeated were the proponents of liberal democracy like Arbenz, or perhaps Vargas Llosa himself. In the afterword of the novel, Vargas Llosa imagines an alternative history in which Cuba might have been different had the United States accepted the modernization and democratization of Guatemala that Arbenz attempted to carry out. Political theorists are keen on such counterfactual conditionals. We need only think of Oliver Stone's JFK, a political thriller whose take on conspiracies features not a coup, but a magnicide, that of John Kennedy. JFK toys with how the United States might have been different had Kennedy's magnicide been averted. This is why British film scholar Michael Coyne regards JFK as a hagiography without the saint. One of the film's presuppositions in this regard is that the Vietnam War would have been avoided if only JFK had lived when actually he had begun the escalation. But back to Latin America, counterfactual speculations can also be seen not only in Vargas Llosa's novel, but also in equally recent Mexican political thrillers that were deeply influenced by Stone's JFK. Carlos Volado's 2012 film, or Natalia Beristain and Hiromi Kamata 2019's Netflix show, do something similar with the magnicide of the Mexican presidential candidate, Luis Donaldo Colosio. They too take for granted that Mexico might have been different and better had Colosio survived the magnicide and become president in 1994. They obfuscate what the candidate could actually have become, perhaps the stooge of his predecessor, Carlos Salinas, or Clinton's, or the cartels, or just another proper name in the list of Mexican heads of state. Through counterfactual speculations, Tiempos Recios falls into this very same magnifying hagiography of Arbenz. Vargas Llosa selectively omits in his alternate history how the United States' allegedly exemplary and importable liberal democratic model is rooted in anti-liberal practices, a model that is filled with systemic violence and inequality, from slavery to segregation, including mass incarceration and unrestricted national capital accumulation at the expense of the working class and racialized minorities, both in Latin America and within US borders. Practices that have proven to be incompatible over and over with neighboring nations and countries deciding to improve their own welfare state through enacting agrarian reforms or increasing fiscal pressures towards US multinational companies. Guatemala is only one example. When Vargas Llosa characterizes US hostility towards social political transformation in Latin America as the Cold War hyperbole, he seems to lose sight of the fact that the intrusive policing of the region had not been an exception, but a norm that precedes and succeeds the Cold War. This is perhaps because, as Biglia suggests, capitalist society is not what it says it is. When it denounces its presumed malfunctions, that is, corruption, fraud, political misdemeanors, at the same time, it reinforces the idea that these are only anomalies. In turn, these counterfactual conditionals entail another type of hyperbole, magnification, a typical trope of secrecy in the genre. The absence of the leader, Arbenz, Colosio, Kennedy, engenders the myth. The coup and the magnicide magnify the ousted, dead politician. As the Mexican writer Aguilar Camín notes, Colosio's assassination magnifies actions, attitudes, and words that otherwise would not have been important. Thrillers rely heavily on these magnifying questions. Would Mexico have spiraled into structural violence if Colosio were not murdered? Would Guatemala or Cuba not have become precarious states if Arbenz had not been overthrown? Because these are counterfactual questions, they remain unanswerable, enhancing one of the main aspects of conspiracies, speculations. It is in this sense that Aguilar Camín notes how magnicides overstate everything that precedes them, making things meaningful that otherwise would have been meaningless. This explains the prolific cultural production around Colosio especially when compared with most presidential candidates who either, after losing or winning, eventually fall into oblivion. Through magnification, political thrillers imagine, in loose terms, a higher power maneuvering significant events that shape society. They articulate, and I quote, common anxieties concerning unexplained events of historical significance, by exacerbating that very significance. In short, the treatment of assassinated and ousted politicians in these works share an underlying teleological orchestration. They seem to say they must have been victims of Magnicides or Coups, these politicians, because otherwise they would have done something good for the people. Magnification and counterfactual conditions are both linked to a literary tradition that goes beyond political thrillers, as well as politics itself. In the first volume of his novel, The Man Without Qualities, Austrian writer Robert Musil discusses a peculiar use of the subjunctive mood, as in the grammatical term, but also in the sense of texture, a finer web, a web of haze imaginings, a way of plotting stories following a fanciful alternative path. For Musil, the future potentiality of this subjunctive mood can be, for its believers, something out and out divine, a fiery, soaring quality, a constructive will, a conscious utopianism that does not shrink from reality, but treats it, on the contrary, as a mission and an invention. Here, Musil is, of course, thinking about something that we all know, moments in which individuals wonders how things would have been if they had done something different in their life. Political thriller representations of these conspiracies, especially of coups and magnicides, make them a collective matter that infuse in their readers and spectators this sort of quasi-religious belief in higher powers operating behind closed doors, the high states of conspiracies in smoke-filled rooms. Thrillers then do not only magnify politicians, but also secrecy. And secrecy, as Taussig notes, following Simmel's sociology of secrets, magnifies reality. In turn, the magnification of reality creates a feedback loop in which the political thriller itself becomes over-important to understand significant political events. Magnification becomes commodification, and thrillers a consumable product that, by means of fiction orchestrations, satisfies desires for the resolution of historical events that remain still contradictory, ambiguous, and precarious. Thank you for staying with me till the end.